Hey Greg, how you doing?
Well, we're rocking this new background. Like I said, it's a it's an amateur program, but we're making efforts to be ever advancing incrementally here, right?
Look
So,
at all the improvements we've made.
yeah.
Stick with us because this is where all the action is.
Well, I mean, that's a bit of a loaded question. It's been a week, I guess, on a number of fronts. I ran into a friend at a grocery store the other day who knew nothing about what's happened in my personal life over the past number of months, and asked me how it was going. And it's one of those things where you're like, man, do I give the honest answer or what do I do? And I gave the honest answer, and I think that's probably really where we're at. Well, all of us, passengers, aviation professionals, and otherwise, I think it's gotten very real, certainly over the past week, right? So,
Isn't it interesting that despite the fact that we're all plugged into roughly the same sources of information, each of our individual realities seems to be slightly different than the next?
yeah, yeah. Well, and especially if you're disconnected from the marginalized minority, it surprises me, I guess, at times how people are like, "Wow, I hadn't thought about that." And I guess what that reinforces is this. It's funny, we were having this conversation at home over dinner the other day about this societal phrase that we all use. Hey, how's it going? And I've always bristled at it because I like to be precise in my speech. And if somebody asks that question, but they've already passed me by the time it sits out of their mouth, it seems a bit disingenuous, right? And I think if we really want to move ourselves forward, getting back to what we're actually talking about, I think it is worth telling people, well, this is actually the reality that I'm going through, because I think the whatever the percentage is, the majority of society doesn't really understand where we're at. And I think humanizing it by not in a whiny way, but in a realistic way of this is where we're going. And I think even at our own company, there's been some good conversations over the past week about different things in terms of what's going on across society, and conversing with people, whether they're in the union or and disconnected from us, and hearing them say, "Wow, yeah, I hadn't thought about that." So,
It's an interesting crossroads, I think, where we're at right now, Greg, because the initial fear that seemed to paralyze society at the onset of COVID has no doubt waned. It's no longer the pressing, abiding focus of all of our lives. Yet many of the policies are still there and still in effect. So now we are actually at a point in time where I think we can have conversations with even those who were most adamant in favor of the COVID policies. And Greg, you and I have watched as some of the notable personalities in our former employers chat forum, where all the employees like to hang out and talk. A couple of the notable personalities who are pushing back against the people in our situation, those who were unvaccinated, are all of a sudden starting to lead the charge, on the notion that this is wrong. We shouldn't be terminating people for differences of what essentially amount to opinions. And these are the perspectives of the people who used to oppose us. These people now see it as a matter of us being terminated for opinions. So I think that that's a significant move in the right direction. And to be honest with you, Greg, I mean, we've had some good stuff happen this week. Seeing that is the one thing that gave me the most pause for hope.
mhm. Yeah, well, and I think it's interesting to note too that I don't know that some of these people's foundational beliefs and worldview as far as vaccines has fundamentally changed. But for them, there was a line in the sand where there's an element of humanity where something in them was sparked, and they just said, "This is unacceptable because we've crossed some lines." And going back to kind of how we started this conversation, that came out of having conversations where we were able to humanize the fact that here's who here's who's behind, or here's what I'm dealing with on a personal level, and telling some of those stories. So and circling back to where we've been over the past week, we're kind of talking around it here. And part of me, we as a group, we represent so many different employers and so many different passengers. And so obviously over the past week, one of our largest groups that's represented within Free to Fly Air Canada has decided to terminate all of their employees who are not vaccinated as of the 1st of May. And so that hit hard for a big portion of our group. Now, I want to also recognize that there's other employees who have already gone down that road. I know some at WestJet, some of the maintenance workers, others. I won't hit them all, so I don't want to try and list them. But what's obvious in the fact is the fact that it's not obvious, right? It's not being talked about broadly in the public, which is. I don't want to say whether if that's a huge piece of impact or not. I think it's certainly, we keep talking about the need to impact the narrative, and I think it's important from that standpoint. But it's really hit a lot of our members hard because it's the proverbial tools in the toolbox are getting more narrow. We're certainly exploiting what we can, but I would say these issues across society are sitting at a very high level, whether it's corporately or governmentally. And I don't want to get into a long conversation about trying to connect these dots, but I guess what I will say is trying to connect the dots of why today, for instance, just in the span of maybe an hour, we hear the UK is rolling back all of their travel mandates. The same thing's happening in France. We see what's happening in our own country. You've got the CEO of Air Canada who's come out and rather sanctimoniously lectured the government about the fact that these travel mandates make no sense when the back sports are leaving, and then 2 weeks later decides to terminate 1,500, 2,000 employees. So these portions certainly we want to recognize. I know we wrestle a little bit with what to say that's truly meaningful to people that are being this deeply impacted. But we want to recognize that it's a difficult time for employees across a number of companies. So,
you said something about 5 minutes ago that really stood out to me.
Because I kept on talking with the monologue that went on.
No, not at all. No. It stood out because it reminded me of something that Jordan Peterson likes to bring up, and it related to how the tone is starting to shift. And we were talking about people in our web forum, how they're now starting to see that, there's some humanity here. And it reminded me of this thing that Jordan Peterson says quite frequently, is that we outsource our sanity. And being in relationship is one of the main methods by which humans essentially assess their own sanity and their own grip on reality. And so there is a component to people's decision making that is outsourced, and I think we saw a significant impact from that in the conformity culture that emerged after COVID first sprung on the scene. And so here you have people that are they're not sure what to do. They see that there's already a trend in progress, and all they have to do the right thing is to just jump on the bandwagon. I mean, it's basically cookie cutter, built for, I don't want to say that all humans are lazy, but all humans have lazy components to them. And it's just purpose built to take advantage of that. Now, what's happening on the flip side of that is that movement is really kind of dissipated. It was an AstroTurf movement from day one. It was never grassroots. It was built up, dreamed up in a public relations firm or many public relations firms. I'm fond of saying, is social distancing a medical concept? Of course not. It's something that was dreamed up in a public relations firm. The term anti-vaxxer, these are all terms that are meant to hit people psychologically. If it was a medical term, it would probably have a Greek name. So if where I'm going with this, though, is that an AstroTurf movement, the only way to keep it going is with money, because there's no heart, there's no soul in an AstroTurf movement. So inevitably, these COVID policies, which are built on AstroTurf, are going to begin to dissipate, and people will lose that sort of that collectivist orientation that they were doing. And now we have an opportunity, and that's where we find ourselves now, to meet these people on their level and actually have good conversations without emotion, and see if we can't get to a middle ground. And gosh, Greg, there's a huge amount of catharsis that comes when you get to a middle ground with somebody. And I'm not even saying that they agree with everything you're saying. It's just made that connection. And I really think that that's what we should all be aspiring to at this point in time.
Well, and I think it's a great segue. You talk about this AstroTurf, the fact that so much of this has been propped up, and I was talking about connecting the dots. And one of the other big things that we're really pushing right now are these changes that are coming to the Canada Labour Code. And so if anybody's listening and if they're not quite sure what I'm talking about, we've got a video that summarizes that. So I won't get into all the details and rehash it, but this is part of a broader situation that's being pushed into society, and you start to connect some of these dots together, whether it's the push forward of a universal basic income. And some people may be saying, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, once you start pushing society down a road like this, where you're forcing people into unemployment, where you're forcing them via the Canada Labour Code, let's say, into a position where, talking to a lot of our colleagues, they're saying, I'm not getting another booster. And we're starting to hear, well, the boosters are coming. All of these things, the government starts to position themselves in a way where it becomes very, very difficult for you to work without checking your conscience at the door and violating all sorts of God-given freedoms. All of these things, you start to see interconnections between them. And I don't want to spend a ton of time hammering it. But the point I'm making here is agreeing with you, saying, listen, there's some common pieces here, even amongst those who may not see the world quite the same as us. Once we start going down a road, let's say with these changes to the Canada Labour Code, I think we could really get people on board. Maybe it's via these changes for all federally regulated employees. Get them on board as far as where things are going with terminations at some of these companies as well. So it's a good point to bring up for sure.
Well, we have more in common than we do things that divide us, and that goes for everybody. And I really think that at the end of the day, really most people are, even those who were up in arms about what was going on either side of the COVID debate, generally were motivated from a place of wanting to see good things happen to humanity. It's not like we want to kill grandma, that's why we're not taking the vaccine. It doesn't work like that. And most people who didn't take the vaccine generally saw it as being something bigger than themselves anyway. So for most folks that made it this far without being vaccinated, there was a component of greater good built into the decision making. I shouldn't say for everybody, but certainly for many of us. And I think that courtesy, or that assumption, the courtesy of making that assumption about the other side is just as valid. So getting to this point where we're now acknowledging that we have more in common than not, I think is a first true step. Now, for people who are starting to feel some degree of optimism, myself included, I really want to underscore the fact that in order to get back to what we enjoyed before COVID, we're going to need to see the same amount of change sweep across our culture as we saw that heralded the arrival of COVID. So the amount of change that we saw bringing in COVID, we're going to have to see that on the way out for us to safely conclude or assume that we have this behind us. Where I'm going with this is that we very likely do not have COVID, both policies and the scare tactics, behind us. I would very much caution everybody to get against getting too comfortable with this idea that we've earned some kind of a victory. When the fall comes around, I would watch for the boosters, and for those who are 2 shots in already and have decided that they don't want to get a booster, now is the time to start considering your options. Get involved in some groups, start talking to your MPs, start talking to your family members, because there's a very real chance that if you don't take a booster, that you will be facing termination as well. And we really need you fighting alongside of us just as bad as we need the unvaccinated.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we've hammered on all of these contact points before, and we're seeing more and more that I don't want to be defeatist as far as our ruling party, but I think a lot of this needs to be exploited by the opposition, and we're in a tough spot in Canada because you've essentially got a majority with the NDP and the Liberals tied in together, but targeting it via some of the opposition shadow critics and otherwise, I think is a viable means to go here as well. On a optimistic note, as far as this labor code, we've got some good meetings that are going on behind the scenes. We're looking to coalesce with we're talking close to 1 million employees across the nation that are going to be under these mandates. Who knows when they may drop. So that's a good point. We've come across some good people. They're willing to partner with us and hopefully coalesce into a larger movement. So one little plug that I've thought of a few times, and just as we wrap up here, Matt, I'll throw it in here, and that is just ways to work within our group. We talk a little bit about being part of a segregated minority here. And I think one way to support each other is to genuinely support each other in quantifiable ways. And so, starting as far back as October, we've got some of our aviation professionals who are out of work, and they chose to end a career, which I would say the vast majority were passionate about, regardless of what that particular profession happened to be. And I find it hard, and I've talked to some of our members who got hired specifically because they were willing to give up their career. And the employer said, wow, I can't think of a better job interview than hearing, somebody stood tall based on conviction. So I would say even amongst our 42,000 members, if there's some of you out there that are business owners or otherwise that are looking for real men and women of character, I'd encourage you to reach out to Free to Fly. Let us know. We've got members coast to coast, and if you're hiring, no matter what that job happens to be, if you could reach out to us, because we've got some great men and women who are looking for work, at least for the next season here. So that was one little plug that I wanted to put in a while back. So
it's a great point, Greg, and they are some of the finest people I've ever worked alongside, truly. Yeah. So these, for anybody offering up employment, this is the creme de la creme.
Yeah, so I think that's most of what we wanted to cover. I know when we were offline here before we got on that, we were talking a little bit. Like I say, we don't script these things. They kind of take a direction of their own, and it was interesting where we meandered this evening. But just in terms of our own humanity, we're wrestling here on an individual basis, certainly with all sorts of things on the home front and the employment front, and also wanting to be genuine and sincere and honest with all of you. And when times are tough, it's tough sometimes to be genuine because you don't want to pretend that things are fantastic when they're not. But I sent Matt a quote the other day, and I think it's quite relevant. And I actually don't remember where I got it from. It was a column somewhere along the way. And it says, when grappling with the existential and the unknowable, you're probably best off trying to do the right thing and then just showing up. And I think so much of where we're at nowadays is, I think, across the board, if you've stuck this long with us in this podcast, you're probably the kind of person who's seeking to do the right thing. And man, sometimes it's just putting your feet on the floor in the morning and then showing up and then taking one bite at a time, right? So,
well said, Greg. And there's one last little piece I'd like to put out there. Greg, you and I have put out some videos, and this is part of our grappling with this process and with our own humanity and our own shortcomings. We've tried to, be a little bit vulnerable, to share a little bit of our inner worlds. And anytime we do that and we get feedback, positive or otherwise, it really matters and it really means a lot. And so to anybody who takes the time to write us, to get in touch with us, make suggestions, or just tell us that you're with us, thank you for doing that, because it's really stuff like that galvanizes us and keeps us going.
Great point. Yeah, for sure. And to I was talking with one of our members today, actually, and there's so many of you that are so encouraging, and you're encouraging across the board. And I actually feel a little bit guilty that Matt and I are seeing these, and so many of our colleagues are going through exactly the same thing as we are, and we really are looking to find a way to share those more broadly. So that's a little project on the side, maybe, but good point there, Matt. So,
well, Greg, I guess that about wraps it up for another week. We'll encourage everybody to stay in the fight, stay strong, stay together. Be, what's the word that you like, Greg? Relentless?
Relentless.
Be relentless. Let's stick with that.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again soon.